Hola and ¿qué tal? Dr. Nate again for your final module for the class, 3.4 Trans Representation. I want to specifically give you an example of a study that I did with a couple of colleagues that talked about privilege and prejudice, white privilege specifically, male privilege and class, in a case study with Caitlyn Jenner. And I think that specific study will give you a little bit more nuanced information about transgender theory, what it means to be trans, gender non-binary, gender queer, gender non-conforming, and then help you, I think, when coupled with the other videos that I'm going to show you on Blackboard, I think those things together will help you get a better understanding of what we're talking about when we look at LGBTQ, but not specifically in sexual orientation, more specifically with the T and the gender. A lot of individual scholars and practitioners have argued for lumping the entire class of people together because L, G, the B, and the Q are all about sexual orientation, whereas the T is specifically about gender. However, another group of academics will argue that it is placed together because the group is lumped together by society and still faces a lot of the marginalized oppression. However, I think we can say that our trans brothers and sisters face, I think, disproportionately more types of oppression than the rest of us. In fact, I think the United States leads the entire world with the most trans women of color killed. I think this year alone, it's been about 14 individuals. Well, 13 individuals have been confirmed dead and one person is still missing and they fear her to be dead. So 14 people so far in the 6 months of 2019 have been killed. Well, not just people, trans women of color specifically. So they still are affected very disproportionately. So I want to go over a couple of key concepts that we talked about in previous modules, because I think it's going to help you understand this one a little bit better, but also it's going to help give you a refresher for the final paper that you're going to be writing and using all of these great class concepts together. So phenomenology, it is the study of lived experiences. It's conscious experiences as experienced from the subjective or first person point of view. So we actually ask people, what happened to you? What did you go through? And of course, experiences for people are very subjective. It's how they experience it. So something that we might feel is not traumatic for another individual might be traumatic, right? We're qualitatively different from one another. And then of course, our intersectionalities, our various points of oppressions all come together to make those experiences very, very much different from one another. And for some individuals, a little bit more extreme. So that's what phenomenology looks at. It looks at the appearance of things as they appear in our appearance. Again, remember symbolic interactionism. Something might appear something completely different for a person who is a trans person of color than for a person who is cisgender and white or cisgender and Asian, right? It's the way we experience things, thus the meanings things have in our own experience are going to be different. And that's what phenomenology is looking at. It's about intentionality, the directness of experience toward things in the world, the property of consciousness that is a consciousness of or about something. So again, the person being able to recall what it was that they experienced. And that is what we're looking at, that intentionality of that experience and how that person felt, how that person experienced it. Our experiences is directed toward, represent, or intends things only through particular concepts, thoughts, ideas, images, etc. These make up the meaning or content of a given experience and are distinct from the things that they represent or mean, right? So our experience for one thing might be completely different than another person, but on top of that, it's going to be how we think about that specific experience with those specific symbols and the things that happen around us, our culture, space, time, all those things come together to shape that experience. So that is a big part of not just transgender theory, but also queer studies and feminist theory, right? How we experience life through a different perspective, through a very different type of feel as well. Yay, you found boxes. Probably so, yeah. All right, thank you. The next thing is intersectionality, and we've gone over intersectionality. I'm sorry for that. I'm here, as you can see, in PSFA, and we're trying to pack all of the stuff here, and so I'm recording the last lecture while getting that done as well, too. Multitasking, maybe. So intersectionality, we talked about this before. It's basically based upon identity politics and the collective view that all of these different identities like race, gender, SES, religion, all these things come together and they intersect to shape not only our overall identity, but also those different points of oppressions that come together. It was first conceptualized by Kimberly Crenshaw in she wrote about it in the late 1980s. It was actually printed in the early 1990s, and people still credit this essential pieces of work for intersectionality. So it's divided into three different intersectionalities. We've talked about this before: structural, political, and representational. Structural is just every person located at these different intersections of experience life and oppressions very differently, and it makes us qualitatively different than one another. Political intersectionality means there might be conflicting political agendas. So for instance, Black Lives Matter might promote race, ethnicity, but not necessarily gender, right, or religion. And so these intersectionalities are different than one another's. And then representational intersectionality. How does that cultural construction of representation in mediated images present, misrepresent, or completely symbolically annihilate these specific intersections that are lived in everyday worlds that we don't see represented in the media? So we see that identities, specifically these very intersectional identities, continue to be a site of resistance for different members of these marginalized and oppressed social groups. Now we're going to talk a little bit about transgender and trans identity theory. This is a theoretical orientation that really is based on gender and gender identity. So remember, when we talk about LGBTQ, the rest of those letters in the acronym are all about sexual orientation, but the T itself is about gender, and that's what makes it stand out. And that's what transgender and trans identity theory really gets at. So Nagoshi is the person who conceptualized this theory. It really does look at not just people who identify as trans, right? Trans identity, transgender, transsexual, but also genderqueer, gender non-binary, and gender non-conforming. It emphasizes this importance of the actual physical embodiment and the actual performance of gender, and with it sometimes sexual identity, right? Because that doesn't mean that just because you are trans means that you're attracted to people of the same sex or the opposite sex. Sexual orientation is a little bit more complicated than that. It integrates this embodiment with the self and socially constructed aspects of identity through the lived experiences of those people with these intersecting identities. It helps reconcile feminist and queer theoretical scholarship with actual social work, practice, and advocacy. So again, we spoke earlier in the semester that queer theory is a branch of feminist theory, and then transgender and trans identity theory is a branch of those two as well too. So it's all about looking at these marginalized identities, the phenomenology, right? The lived experiences of people who identify with this identity, and then how can we actually use scholarship for pragmatic, practical, professional changes in the real physical world. Also, the theory aims to empower transgender individuals and build coalitions between them and other socially oppressed groups. Remember, if one of us is oppressed, we're all oppressed. And so it kind of looks at how transgender individuals can make these coalitions, but also how intersectionality plays a role in trans lives and makes those oppressions maybe a little bit more difficult, a little bit harder, or maybe how we also see some of these intersections providing a little bit of privilege and helping out individuals. And we'll speak specifically to that with the Caitlyn Jenner stuff here in a minute. Transgenderism is about breaking of gender roles and gender identity and crossing the boundaries of gender from one to another. So being born as a physically cisgender, biologically male, and then transitioning to a trans woman, right? That's kind of what transgenderism talks about. It typically is expressed through these gender identities outside traditional heteronormative definitions of what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, and how do you perform these different genders as well. And transgender individuals differ widely in the degree of belief in the fluidity of gender identity. Some individuals will say that they adhere to the gender binary, I transition from a man to a woman, or vice versa. And others, like people who identify as genderqueer, gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, really don't see this as a dichotomy. They see it as gender as a continuum, and people just kind of sliding along back and forth this continuum however they choose and please. And then, of course, the more clinical term transsexualism is defined as innate and biologically not chosen, whereas transgenderism is thought of as learned, freely chosen, and socially determined. And that right there, of course, is arguable depending on the discipline of study and the academic that you ask. Even professional practitioners in the medical and psychological world too kind of go back and forth with these different definitions. But for us, when we're speaking about transgender theory, it is about this acknowledgement that gender is not something that is essential to a person. When we start to essentialize gender, it's the same thing as essentializing race, as essentializing class, social economic status, right? And saying that because things are supposed to be natural and essentialized, then we open the door for more oppression and more victimization. So by disrupting and queering, we're able to take all of these different types of categories that are once normalized and seen as traditional in the baseline and disrupt that and throw out the window where everyone is just existing. And we want to know about their phenomenological experiences, right? How are they living their life? So let's talk about this case study specifically that we did to give you a little bit better idea of how we can apply transgender theory to a specific academic endeavor, but also to media, right? So we have probably one of the most famous cases of a celebrity transitioning in the course of their life. We had Bruce Jenner, who transitioned about 4 years ago to Caitlyn Jenner. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see Bruce Jenner winning the gold medal in the men's decathlon in 1976 at the Summer Olympics in Montreal. He was also one of the first people to be put on the cover or on the box of Wheaties cereal. And then he is probably most known for being married to Kris Jenner and being part of the Kardashian clan. In 2015, we see the full transition to Caitlyn Jenner, and then she is on the cover of Vanity Fair. Bruce Jenner before 2015 used male pronouns, and then in 2015 she then transitioned to using female pronouns. Individuals sometimes that identify as trans or gender non-binary, gender queer, or gender non-conforming will sometimes use their preferred pronouns of male or female, but then they may also just use they, them, and theirs. It's always important to ask individuals how they identify what their pronouns are so that you correctly gender them when speaking to them. It's not seen as a form of judgment or rudeness for you to ask somebody what their pronouns are. It's actually welcomed and seen as a sign of respect and letting people know that you care about how they identify and you want to treat them with respect. So I Am Cait. This is the show that debuted back in July 26th of 2015 on E! And all of this stuff happened really quickly. Bruce Jenner did an interview with Diane Sawyer, and then the Kardashians had this big family special about how they reacted to it. And then we saw Caitlyn Jenner then start appearing in the media all the way up into different media appearances up until her show came out on E! 2.7 million people saw it live same day. So as soon as it appeared at 7 p.m. on July 26th, all these people tuned in and watched it, and even more people saw it on syndication and on their TiVo where they recorded it. The show is about Caitlyn Jenner, who is 65, and it follows her through her self-education about transgender issues. And they pair her with 3 or 4 other different trans women, mostly trans women of color, to try to educate her about what it means to be a transgender individual, because Caitlyn made the transition relatively quickly compared to other people who have been dealing with different types of oppression that come along with transition since their early teens and even childhood. It talks about celebrity and privilege. When it finally ended at the end of that season, there was 1.3 million people who tuned in for the season finale. It was renewed for a second season. Less people tuned in for that. A lot of people cited being turned off by the representation or lack of representation, and the show was not renewed for a third season. So I Am Cait only has 2 seasons. Here is a comment from somebody from the New York Post who talks about media. I Am Cait is delivered as TV with a message. Caitlyn Jenner's transition is valid, her activism vital, and her future very much an at work in progress. As she embraces her new body, designer wardrobe, and trans BFFs, Cait is doing good in order to feel good about her senior age shape-shifting. So they're giving what they think is very positive affirmations about what the show is, but here, as we can see, as soon as Caitlyn transitioned, she was treated very much in these very gendered stereotypes, right? New body, work in progress, designer wardrobe, BFF. All of these are stereotypes that we usually associate with how the media and other people cover women. So she was very quickly treated as a woman when the show was debuted. And then, of course, senior age shapeshifting. So again, being called a shapeshifter, not something that's positive for a lot of individuals who are transitioning or are along the gender non-conforming, genderqueer, gender non-binary continuum. Here is Melanie Schneiderman, who is a trans activist. She also is trans. She said, very torn. I applaud her bravery in going public, and I hope she inspires other trans people to do the same. Anyone who encourages people to be strong and to live your life on your terms is okay in my book. However, she also has a lot to benefit that other people in transition do not have. Having seen a couple of friends transition, her experience does not seem to be representative. It's great to have the money to splurge on a whole new wardrobe, to have a hair and makeup team, to not have to scrape and scrimp in order to afford hormone therapy or surgery, to attempt to transition while in college, working full-time, etc. It's awful tough to give other people advice on how to prevail in the face of circumstances that you've never actually been through. And I think this perhaps has been the biggest criticism for Caitlyn Jenner, that she had all the money and the privilege and power and was able to transition very rapidly, while other people are not afforded the same type of privileges. And also the criticism for her, the fact that maybe she wasn't aware that she had those privileges and thought that everybody else did too, which is very evident in the first few episodes of season 1 of I Am Cait. Jessica Orozco, another trans woman. I was rooting for her in the beginning, but yeah, now with that sort of thinking coming from someone that does not know how it is for us out in real life, I just shake my head and tisk tisk every time I see commercials for her show. Not a good role model for my people, unfortunately. So all of these different comments that were being made at a very public media level really have people thinking about, how is she, Caitlyn Jenner, being portrayed, and how are people reacting to that portrayal, right? Why does it matter? Why does all of these things matter, and why do these questions matter? Well, because we know that gender roles are socially constructed, right? We go back to Judith Butler, and the way we perform gender is all a social construct. It's this symbolic interactionism of how we think a traditional man and woman should act, which is tied to patriarchy, hegemony, heteronormativity, and all these different oppressions that come along with people who do not adhere to this normalized, normative way of looking at things, right? If you're outside the hegemony, then you are othered. Society has multiple methods of positive and negative reinforcement, and a lot of this also happens through the media. Media has a way to show what is positive, what's negative, and make society kind of fall in line. Media also has the power to cultivate attitudes, cognitions, and behavior. So if somebody has never had a physical interaction, right, a face-to-face interaction with a person who's trans, then all of the understanding about trans people primarily comes from the media, and how that media portrays trans people affects the way that person then thinks about them, feels about them, and behaves towards people who are trans or gender nonconforming. The trans community, as I mentioned, may not be obtrusive to some people. One's identity is not also just about self-identification. It also is about affirmation from people around them, right? It's tied to this larger social structure that intersects with group memberships, whether that group membership is familial, whether it's gender, whether it's class, whether it's other people who are trans. All of these interactions help affirm one person's identity. So identity is a back and forth negotiation, right? These intersections generate oppression and sometimes opportunity. And opportunity is one of those things that we're going to talk about specifically with Caitlyn Jenner, because that was something that came out. So a research question for this specific study, 2 of them. How has the public viewed Caitlyn Jenner throughout her coming out process? Specifically, what public discourse surrounds her sexuality, her race, ethnicity, her SES, and celebrity status? Those are the intersections we're looking at. And then we're going to do a discourse analysis of tweets from a random sample of tweets that came along this timeline. And we're looking at this timeline here specifically. Bruce Jenner on April 24th officially came out on television with an interview with Diane Sawyer. This was April 24th, and said, I am transitioning. I will now be known as a woman. I will now use female pronouns, and my name is Caitlyn Jenner. Then on May 17th, the Kardashians had a family special on E! Where all the Kardashians came together. Specifically, they spoke to Bruce's children that are Kylie and Kendall, and they talked about how they felt about the transition and what it meant for them as a family. On June 30th, we finally got our first glimpse of what Caitlyn Jenner looks like. And she was done up on the cover of Vanity Fair, very sexualized, very feminine, like a pinup model. On July 15th, Caitlyn Jenner received the ESPN Arthur Ashe Award, and a lot of criticism came along with that as well, because there were some people who didn't understand why transitioning was brave for anyone across the board. So a lot of people had to be educated about that. And then on July 26th, the premiere of I Am Cait happened on E! So we looked at tweets that were tweeted between April 24th and July 26th to get this kind of overall opinion of how people thought about how Caitlyn Jenner was being represented in the media and what they thought about Caitlyn Jenner. We found a lot. All of these things came up, right? White privilege, male privilege, they're not the same. They are the same. Fame, celebrity, wealth, representation, support, caution, undeserving accolades, teachable moments, political ideologies. All of these things came together as well too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go really quickly through all of these different themes and a tweet or two that really evidences why this is a theme. So white privilege. This person wrote, Jenner is the epitome of white privilege. She's being glorified for the same shit black transgenders are being slaughtered for. So again, looking at this opportunity of what her race ethnicity has afforded her, specifically compared to transgender of color, or black transgender women and men. Male privilege. Male privilege is reaping the rewards of manhood for decades until it earns you enough to purchase womanhood from a surgeon. So some people really chastised Jenner for living 65 years as a white man and using that privilege to get the ability to transition. Some people said they're not the same. Using Caitlyn Jenner to say all trans women benefit from male privilege is like using Beyonce to say all black women benefit from being black. So again, they're not the same, but sometimes they intersect. Again, it's contextual. All experiences are different from one another, qualitatively different from one another. Age and privilege. Caitlyn Jenner forgets that she has lived 65 years as Bruce in full possession of his white privilege, hashtag LGBTQ. Fame and celebrity, one of the biggest things that people keep bringing up. Caitlyn Jenner has celebrity status, a high profile, a platform, and wealth to help her transition, unlike most transgenders. Wealth. Yes, Caitlyn, I'm sure it's for you. Wealth and privilege have shielded you from reality of being trans in the US. A lot of criticism on how she can understand or give advice to people when she hasn't faced the same obstacles. Caitlyn does not represent the trans community. Caitlyn Jenner, how can you be a role model spokesperson for a disenfranchised group with your straight white male privilege still intact? So you see a lot of these words still keep coming up again. White, male, and privilege. Inspired by @Caitlyn Jenner's speech, while it's true she still has white privilege, as a trans woman, every drop of progress counts. So even though we see that these intersections may not be the same as others, we're still talking about trans women, and a trans woman is on television, so it's a little bit of progress. Political ideologies. Just heard some idiot liberal talk about how Caitlyn Jenner is strong because she's giving up her male privilege. Smart take, not. So we saw a lot of people who were conservative and Republicans directly criticizing trans people, and also this assumption that people who are LGBTQ and trans are automatically liberal, which is not the truth. In fact, if you look at both Bruce Jenner and Caitlyn Jenner's public rhetoric about politics, it's very conservative, very Republican. In fact, even after the transition, Caitlyn Jenner very much spoke out in support of President Donald Trump. And only here recently has she realized that Trump's policies are not beneficial for her in the intersection of being trans. And she has since then kind of gone back on a lot of the supports and accolades that she has given Donald Trump. No type of privilege. Besides saying Caitlyn Jenner has white male privilege is ridiculous. She is now a woman. She lost both her male and her cis privileges. So therefore, she is disenfranchised as a woman. We cannot say she has any of those, currently, those privileges. Treat it like a woman. Damn, Caitlyn Jenner. I see you with your big old tiggle bitties. Boing. Caitlyn, sexy. Can I motorboat? Breastfeed me. Suckle on your teat. So again, as soon as she transitioned to a woman, she was treated with the misogynistic rhetoric that most women face on a daily basis. Sexualized by media. Sexy lady @Caitlyn Jenner shows cleavage for screening of the film Tangerine. So again, covering her with the same stereotypes and adjectives that other women are covered for in Hollywood. So it's not just about her showing up, but her, what she was wearing, and showing a little bit of cleavage as well. So sexualizing her as well. So what does all of this say to us? Why is it important? What's going on? Well, Caitlyn's intersectionality of her privileges and things that maybe are not privileges, right, are all evidenced in these tweets. Her privileges not only afford her the current opportunities she has, but also separates her a lot from the majority of the trans community, a majority of the trans community who does not have the same experiences, the same phenomenology as Caitlyn Jenner. Public discourse on Twitter provides mostly negative reactions to Caitlyn's transition, but we did see a couple of positive things in there, specifically talking about how any type of representation or any type of step forward is a good step forward. While there's negative, there's also positives, and Caitlyn can be considered, like I said, a step forward for the trans community.